Now stopping by our booth here at EWTN's On Location at the Catholic Marketing Network in Chicago is Kevin Vost, author. Hey, Kevin, good to see you again.
Pleasure to be here.
How are you doing? We got a couple of books to talk about with you. The first one is The Hounds of the Lord, Great Dominican Saints Every Catholic Should Know, and also The Seven Deadly Sins, a domestic guide to vanquishing vice and sin. Okay, Kevin, now let me ask you a question in The Hounds of the Lord. Now, this isn't a look back at famous St. Bernards or something like that, right? Who are the Hounds of the Lord?
Sure, it plays on a medieval Latin pun. You know, they're called the Dominicans after St. Dominic, their founder, and Domini means of the Lord, and canis, the word for dogs, like canine, we had that. So they're often called the Hounds of the Lord or the Dogs of the Lord, and some of those early Dominicans really took that and ran with it. One of their fifth master general, Blessed Humbert, cited some verses from Isaiah and the Psalms that talked about dogs, and he said, well, yeah, the preachers should be like roving dogs who wander about hither and thither, hungry to devour souls into the body of the church. So we had this imagery of the Dominicans going out there like hungry dogs to capture safe souls.
Now, in the foreword, Sister Matthew Marie talks about the fact that you, having been taught by Dominicans, you have an interest in the Dominicans, and you also said, she says, when one thinks of Dominicans, one usually thinks of their great intellect. Kevin Vost, however, provides us with a rich mosaic of Dominicans that illustrates how these great intellectuals were not simply thinkers. What did she mean when she said that?
Yeah, I think one thing, I was very blessed to have Sister Matthew Marie write that forward. I had worked with her at Aquinas College there in Nashville.
Right.
I organized the book in terms of what I call thinkers, doers, and lovers, just kind of categorizations, building on the idea of the contemplative and the active life. Because the Dominicans are really known for a special devotion to study, probably their most famous son being St. Thomas Aquinas, the master theologian, his teacher, St. Albert the Great, the patron saint of scientists.
And these are various ones you deal with in the book.
Yes, I do chapters on them, and it was those kind of thinkers who drew me into the church. And my own story, I grew up taught by Dominicans in grade school, but in my late teens read some of the wrong kinds of philosophers and considered myself an atheist for 25 years.
Really? I didn't know that, okay.
Yeah, until my early 40s, it was actually the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas that drew me back to the church. So I'd always had this strong affinity for those great thinkers, but as I learned more and more about the Dominicans, I was just drawn to the other figures like saints like St. Martin de Porres, who's always depicted with a broom. He was a porter, he was a lay brother at first, and then became a brother. So the more I learned about the Dominicans, the more I knew how rich they were. You know, they're great thinkers, but they're also great doers and great lovers.
And also St. Rose of Lima, who was a contemporary of his, basically.
Absolutely, St. Rose of Lima, another very loving person, known for that one-on-one, care and love for people, not as a great scholar, but as a person who really showed Christ's love to the people right around her.
Okay. Now you also talk about here in the beginning of the book the idea of Jesus Christ as a traveling preacher and that image, and you see that as relating directly to what the Dominicans did.
Yeah, exactly. The Dominicans took the example of Christ in his main social ministry, just traveling around preaching the good word. And when they founded their order at the same time as the Franciscans in the early 13th century, that became their model. They weren't going to be, stationary in the monastery like the monks, and they weren't going to be, just tied directly to one diocese like the clerical diocesan priests. So they had this image of an order that would go around and preach. It was pretty novel at the time because most of the preaching was done by bishops, not even the parish priests. So there was a great call to go out and spread the word. So that became their model. Christ
also
as a
because
preacher.
the education level sometimes of the local priest wasn't that great when it came to those kind of issues, like talking about St. Matthew's Gospel, which is where they got that out of, right?
Yes, they got the idea from St. Matthew's Gospel. That's exactly right. And for that problem with the education, that again became one of the things the Dominicans became known for. Their priests were affiliated with the University of Paris. All the people, the religious coming in, were given this education so they could more effectively go out to people in the world and evangelize them, showing them they knew the current issues of the day, they knew secular facts and science, but they also knew the gospel.
Well, I was very pleased in reading the book that Bookmark was an inspiration for you. You say, that bookmark was my my aha. We need a new popular book. I was wondering, I thought to help celebrate the jubilee of this wonderful order. So which Bookmark show was it that gave you the inspiration, or did I misread that?
It might have, I'm thinking I might have used a Bookmark without a capital B.
Okay.
Though I am always inspired by Bookmark. Yeah, actually, I'd given a few talks for Dominican schools on Dominican saints like St. Dominic and St. Martin de Porres, and I was writing another book, and I just took a break, glanced down at my bookmark, which was a holy card those Nashville Dominican sisters gave me, and it mentioned that 2016 was the year of the 800th Jubilee year of the Dominican Order.
Right, we just had that, right?
And some of those sisters said, hey, are you ever going to write a biography of St. Dominic? I said, well, I don't know. But the idea came to me, what a great year to introduce people to a variety of Dominican saints. So that's where the idea for this book came about.
Okay.
I'm going to do a series of kind of mini biographies introducing people just to Dominic himself and to several of his saints that have been here for, 800 years now.
Right. Now, further into the book you talk about and you break it out as legends, lives, lessons, and legacies. Why did you decide to break it out that way?
Yeah, because I like L's, I like alliteration a lot.
Okay.
Yeah, and for the legends, there's so many the pious stories that have accrued around these saints, and some of them are very, very amazing. Special miraculous graces and visions we see with many of these saints. So I wanted to incorporate those. In terms of the lives, I also wanted to give some sense of just the basic facts of their lives. When did they live? Where were they? What were the main facts of their life, as you would typically have in a biography. But as we get now into the lessons, that's really what I see as the heart of this book. I wanted to cover these saints, not just to know the facts of their lives, but to learn, well, what can they teach us?
Right.
What can they teach us about, being deeper thinkers, being more engrossed in prayer, more focused on contemplating God, and also, doing and acting in our own lives.
So in writing this book, what did they teach you?
Well, they taught me, one, like I see myself characterized more of a thinking type person. And by studying people like St. Albert, St. Thomas Aquinas, and also St. Catherine of Siena, the three Dominican doctors for the church, you just inspire me to go deeper in my learning, deeper in my deep reading to try to gain those insights, but always backed by prayer, because they all said, even more than the study itself, they always started with prayer, and it was prayer that opened up their hearts and minds to those lessons. Then also from the other saints, like particularly St. Rose of Lima, St. Martin de Porres, Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati. I classified them as the lovers. And there I see that great inspiration that even if you're not going to go out and change the world, even if you're not going to write the Summa Theologica, we can all make a difference in our daily lives, just interacting with our own families and parishioners and co-workers and those around us. So that was a big inspiration.
And that's how you clarify it and classify them as the three parts of the doers, the thinkers, and the lovers.
Yes.
And that's what you really broke them up at. And it's interesting too, because like you say, it's really a good insight, because in many ways we do tend to think of the Dominicans of just being the thinkers.
That's right, and they were very, very
teachers.
Rounded. That's true. Right. So even with the ones that I classified as one of the three, I also pointed out how they're all of those three. We look through all of them as thinkers, doers, and lovers, because we're all called to, to love God with all that we are. Okay,
so that's Hounds of the Lord, Great Dominican Saints Every Catholic Should Know. You also have another book that you put together called The 7 Deadly Sins, that came out maybe in the same year, last year as well, right?
Yes.
Now this particular, most people would say they hear that all the time. There's movies called The 7 Deadly Sins, but most of us don't remember what those are anymore. Why were you attracted to talking about those, and what are they?
Okay, sure. I'd written about them briefly in the books I've done on memorizing things. Here's how you memorize their names. But in doing that research, I found out what a great wealth there was in our church history of just what these sins are, how they lead to other kinds of sins. So I wanted to research where this all came from. Now, in the Catechism, it lists the 7 deadly sins as pride, avarice, envy, wrath, lust, gluttony, sloth. Did I leave any out? But in the Catechism, but they're not listed all 7 in the Bible. Okay, this developed over time. So in the first half of this book, I give that history, how it started with ancient Eastern desert fathers with this list of 8 assailing thoughts. Okay. And later came through people like St. John Casson, St. Gregory the Great, St. Thomas Aquinas, and came to be what we now know as the 7 deadly sins, or they're also called the 7 capital sins or capital vices.
Right. Now in writing this book, going into it or maybe exploring it, what did you feel most related to you?
Yeah, that's interesting. What most related to me?
Yeah.
It pains me to say it, but those personal sins of, well, one, gluttony has always been an issue. I have a background in weightlifting
sympathy on that. Okay.
And in my background in weightlifting, we used to what we call bulk up.
Right.
We almost trained ourselves in gluttony, thinking the more I eat, the stronger I get. So I've always wanted to grapple with that. But I think some of the greatest insights come through really on all the sins. But a couple I would say or two are envy and vainglory. Now, Thomas and Gregory used vainglory instead of pride in their list because they thought that pride was even more fundamental.
Right.
More willful turning away from God, where vainglory is more like a seeking glory and honor for the wrong things, for the wrong reasons. But there's wonderful insights and all, but just a few that come to mind are gluttony, envy, vainglory.
Well, for people reading this book, and the book's been out, what has been the reaction? What do people usually connect on today? Do you hear feedback from people say, oh, the one that really struck me was this particular virtue that I'm having trouble with?
Okay,
this deadly sin is reflective of.
Yeah, I'll tell you.
The virtues really combat those sins, right?
They do. Probably the thing that people say to me most often is, I laid out what they called the daughters or the offspring of these sins. The way St. Gregory and Thomas talked about them, all the sins lead in a sequence to others. And so many people have told me that has helped them examine their consciences before confession to see, have I been envious, or have I talked about other people behind their back? Have I diminished their accomplishments, slighted them to their face?
Right.
Have I been joyful when they become sad? Things like that.
You were in on my confession recently, apparently. Yeah, well, it is interesting when we realize some of the things we do and realize that they're derivative of some of these other greater sins.
That's right. We can break them down to little thoughts, little feelings, little behaviors we have with it. We may not realize the connection until we see the way these great followers of the church and doctors have laid them out.
And also, I would say what you tend to find, I know Teresa Avila always talked about the little sins. They break the wall down, and so it may be with the idea if you recognize in a small way what you're doing, it'll stop you from continuing on that path where you might be doing the more deadly sins directly, right?
That's exactly right. It's part of the idea behind the deadly sins is that, like gluttony, there's worse things than eating too much, but it can be like a doorway sin, a lack of self-control that might lead you to sexual sins. You're not used to controlling
any kind
your body.
of gluttony, right?
Yeah, so any of these small...
That level of selfishness and denial of other people because everything needs to be mine, I want everything.
That's exactly right, and we want to avoid making these habits becoming vices as opposed to virtues, so we don't develop the tendency to act in those sinful ways.
It seems like everybody's so busy today, but we still got a sin called sloth, okay? Do you think that that's one that people still have out there?
Yeah, I think so, because sometimes it's misinterpreted as just like being lazy.
Being lazy, yeah, just hanging around.
But it's more. It's actually it used to be called acedia, a lack of care, an apathy. So it's kind of a spiritual apathy. Okay. And sometimes we might be very, very busy because we're avoiding our spiritual life. I'm just too busy to go to church. I'm too busy for a prayer life. I have all these other important things to do. And that can actually be a spiritual sloth, even in people who are very physically active.
Right, and in the sense of realizing there's things I need to work on, but I avoid them because I don't want to deal with them.
That's right. You're not giving the appropriate care. And Thomas Aquinas saw that as a kind of an affront against Christ's first great commandment to love God with all your heart. When we experience spiritual sloth, we're not doing that. We're not showing adequate concern.
So how do you slash sloth?
How do you slash? Yeah, for
that's
sloth.
What you got in a slashing sloth.
I did. I love that alliteration. All the chapters are like that.
I see that. Okay.
But I kind of lay out what I call battle plans for these sins. For each of the 7 sins, we go looking through several different lenses. And one is like knowing these sins, knowing what we call their daughters, the related sins, or knowing the varieties of sins. Like for gluttony, it's not just eating too much. It can be being too picky about what you want to eat. Snubbing your nose at plain foods, or wolfing your food down, not showing table manners. So the first step for all these sins is really knowing what they are. That way we can examine our conscience and go to confession, confess these sins. Another thing is to counter the contrary virtues of sin. One that I give for sloth is often diligence. You're going to just go ahead and do those things you should be doing in your spiritual life. But another great one, I think, is gratitude. If you're more consciously aware of all the good things God has done for you, you're going to be a lot less likely to be apathetic and not to care and not to pray and to follow the precepts of the church.
Is the reason you put gluttony near the end? Is that just how the list works?
Gluttony near the end. It's interesting. Actually, the list follows the order that Thomas Aquinas addressed them in the Summa Theologica.
Okay.
And his order is mainly based on virtue, so it's kind of secondary. But there's another connection there. The ancient church fathers really saw gluttony as a precursor to lust because they're the two physical sins, and one leads to the other. And some saw other sins acting that way, kind of like a deadly dominoes that one would lead to the other.
And you also put in a couple of appendixes at the end, Wicked Words, A Brief History, Christ's Last Seven. Why'd you decide to put those in at the back of the book?
Well, I kind of like to give people the bells and whistles to dig deeper. One of the things I did in the book was I went through Fulton J. Sheen's. He wrote a book about Christ's last 7 words on the cross and how they relate to the 7 deadly sins. So I wanted to draw people's attention to that in each chapter. Then at the end, I kind of laid them out. Boom, here they are. And for the wicked words, I wanted to give some history, why we use these particular words, where they came from. in Scripture, in the early Greek fathers, later Latin fathers, and why we use those particular words now. So I think it helps us understand them in even more depth.
Okay, very, very good. Both of these are Sophia, our good friends at Sophia, of course, and it's the 7 Deadly Sins, a Thomistic Guide to Vanquishing Vice and Sin, and also the latest book, Hounds of the Lord, Great Dominican Saints Every Catholic Should Know, and the author is Kevin Vost. Thank you, Kevin, so much for stopping by here at CMN, and of course these are books available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. We're here at the Catholic Marketing Network, and stopping by is Kevin Lowry. Good to see you, Kevin.
Good to see you, Doug.
A couple of books, How God Hauled Me Kicking and Screaming into the Catholic Church, and Faith at Work, Finding Purpose Beyond the Paycheck, both by OSV. And of course, I know you as well from working with the Coming Home Network.
That's right.
Which you talk about here as well.
Yeah.
And so you've been involved for a long time. Let's talk about your first book, the latest one, the Kicking and Screaming one. And you say that How God Hauled Me Kicking and Screaming. Why did he bother you, do you think?
I don't know.
Okay.
But it really was a really tough and long process. And I was a bit of a hard case, I'm afraid. So it took a long time, and it was often against my will that I made progressive steps towards the church.
Right. So in the forward, you got Scott Hahn. And so when you were considering you were a Presbyterian, right? Okay.
Right.
Though you went to Catholic University, Catholic College, right?
As I remember. Called Franciscan University.
So when you met Scott Hahn, and you needed convincing, he handed you his cassette, and you listened to that. No, that didn't happen.
No,
what
that
did he
didn't
give
happen.
you?
But what he gave me was a rosary, and that was the tipping point of everything. Because as a Presbyterian, if you start praying the rosary, you're putting yourself in very dangerous territory.
Okay.
So I started praying that rosary. It had been about 10 years worth of just getting to know Catholics and starting to understand
And
a
you
little
still
bit
wanted
of the
to come in?
theology. I wanted nothing to do with it for the most part, but then he gave me this rosary, and it was like everything changed.
Right.
Within a few weeks, I thought, you know what, I want to become Catholic.
And he said that was what helped him too.
Yeah.
Was that idea of praying away. So in the introduction you say, here's something I believe. If Catholicism is true, then it should change us. And that's some of the things sometimes you hear people say, and even from outside Scott Hahn, well, if you really believe what you say you believe, why would you live your life the way you do?
Right, right. Well, and the challenge is to truly live it in every possible way, to allow the faith to permeate every aspect of our lives. And I remember when my dad was going through his conversion process, he was a Presbyterian minister, among other things.
Okay, I didn't realize.
And he told me, he said, go to a place where people are allowing themselves to be changed by the faith. And I thought that was great advice, but I never thought at the time that it was the Catholic Church where that was happening.
Did he think that at the time when he said that?
I think not at all. But what I found out later was that he was actually a closet Catholic.
Oh, was he really?
A year after my wife and I came into the church, my mom and dad did too.
Okay. So had that been something he had been considering or at least musing about at some point?
I think
But of
so.
course, as you point out in a book like this, and certainly we know from the Coming Home Network and from discussions with Marcus, you're not just talking about people who are, in a sense, saying, well, I think I'll go to this church rather than that church now. You're talking about people who are taking away their livelihood.
Yeah.
And you're an author of a business book.
Yeah.
The idea of saying, well, I'm walking away from how I thought I would not only spend my life and my career, but how I would support my family.
Yeah, that's right. Because if you, outside the Catholic Church, things look a lot different. The church itself looks different from the outside than from the inside.
Right.
But if you are a serious Christian and you're Presbyterian or something, you go and you become a minister, or you become a missionary, or you want to dedicate your entire life to it. It's very sincere. It's very good, but it's missing something, because fundamentally we don't have to be ministers or of course priests or anything like that to take the gospel seriously.
Right.
We just need to allow it to truly transform us.
Well, you said it, and you talk a lot about conversion and the conversion process and the transformation. You say to undergo conversion is to become different, or perhaps it's more accurate to say that it is to be made different. What's that distinction in your mind?
Really, the distinction is there's only so much we can do, and the rest has to be done by God through grace. And I think that, so more than just us advancing in holiness, it's almost like we have to tear our hearts open and allow God to change us. So it's kind of a both and, right? We need to try to make our proactive steps, and at the same time we need to be open to being changed by the Lord himself.
You make the point that most conversions are not linear. What do you mean?
Yeah. because at least in my case, I mean, I went to a Catholic university. I had a great time with the social aspects of the school, so much so that I was actually invited to leave for a while and take an enforced hiatus. I talk about this in the book.
Yeah.
But then I came back, and it was really sort of one step forward and 2 or 3 steps back before things started progressing. Because the second time around, I had to take Catholic theology courses, and I wasn't interested at all. We had a semester-long course in Humanae Vitae, and I didn't. And I said, "Well, what's that?" And they said, "Well, it's an encyclical." I said, "Well, what's that?" And they said, "It's something the Pope wrote." I said, "Well, what's he talking about?" They said, "Birth control." I said, "Why are we even discussing this?"
Yeah, isn't this a dead issue? It's a dead letter.
Completely different worldview. That's right.
Even for some people in the church. You say, in your conversion, you say, there are some hard facts that I had to deal with along the way.
Yeah.
What were the hard facts you had to deal with?
The hard facts were that I needed to change the way that I viewed the world, and the way that I viewed sexuality, the way that I viewed married life, the way that I viewed children. And of course it did change because my wife wasn't Catholic either.
Okay.
We both came into the church together.
Was she Presbyterian?
She was Wesleyan.
Okay.
But then now we have 8 kids, so it's had a very practical impact on our lives because we went from seeing kids. So that Humanae Vitae class. It stuck, yeah.
Okay.
But we went from looking at kids as economic liabilities to unmitigated blessings.
Right.
Just completely
Which
different.
is a lot of the way society looks at it today.
Oh, sure.
Right, exactly. Sure. Now you talk about having reached that moment of grace, and I think in terms of a Protestant view many times where it's a one-time event, and you make the point that the moment of grace is what we often call conversion, but as I've already said, conversion can rarely be reduced to a moment.
Right.
And that's really a Catholic perspective.
Yeah.
Right?
So when I was a kid, I accepted Jesus as my personal Lord and Savior because that's what you did if you wanted to take the faith seriously. And it was very sincere, and there's something very good about that, making a decision for Christ. That's great. But what I didn't realize is that you have to do that every single day, and sometimes many times a day. And I was missing some of the equipment that was required to really pull that off that I now know are the sacraments.
Now you say we are all backsliders, all of us must constantly recommit. Well, do you think there's people out there today say, well, what's the point? If I'm going to start, maybe I might go for this thing one time only and I'm saved. Okay, that sounds okay. But for me, you to be telling me, well, I do that, but that's just the beginning of the journey.
Right.
Why bother?
Well, if you're not going to bother, then you don't bother. But Jesus tells a parable about this, right? About the seed that's thrown on the soil, and there are some shoots up very quickly and then withers away and dies, and then some hits the rich soil and it flourishes over the course of time. There are lots of different responses to the gospel.
Right.
Sometimes it just takes time as seeds are planted over the course of time, and then the Holy Spirit causes them to flourish. And it's not our doing. So if I were trying to evangelize somebody, really conversion is above my pay grade. But what I can do is I can plant seeds, and then those seeds can later flourish.
And many of those are the way you live your life, and
Absolutely.
what people see you do, as they say, you're walking the walk. You say, I've tried to walk the road of conversion for many years now. I like to think I've learned a few things in this book. I hope to share some of that knowledge with you. Now, you came into the church when you were 25.
Yeah.
What took you so long to write a book about your conversion?
Well, first of all, I didn't have the time to do it, but I had written previously. My story was in Surprise by Truth 2 back in the day.
Pat Madrid's book.
Pat Madrid's book, which is a wonderful book. Lots of terrific conversion stories in there. But the thing that was just eating at me was that I wanted to tell this story that's really a story of discovery. But I wanted to do it in a way that would appeal to skeptics, so that if somebody's sitting out there who isn't quite sure about the church, they can pick up this book and not be offended. It'll give them things to think about, but it's not in their face in a way that will turn them off. So my wife has a 93-year-old grandmother who's Baptist, and she read the book, and I was thrilled that I got this very gracious and very kind letter that she enjoyed it.
Really?
So I wanted this to be something that we could give to friends, give to relatives, give to people who just don't see it this way.
To at least open the discussion.
Absolutely.
Or give them something to think about.
So
that's you kicking and screaming into the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
Previous to that, you had another book called Faith at Work, Finding Purpose Beyond the Paycheck. Now you're a CPA?
I'm a CPA.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how does one marry work, and faith, and is that something you were always good at?
Yeah. Well, the answer to the second question is no. I was not always good at it because I was really of the opinion that your faith was over here and your work was over here, and you sort of had to keep them separate. And I think a lot of people
really
operate that way. Absolutely.
Okay.
But what I discovered, especially as I was challenged in the workplace, is that model doesn't work because we as individuals are integrated by our very nature. So it's hard to go to work and just discard all of our beliefs and everything that we think. So isn't it better to approach it and really to view it in a way that our faith can make us better in the workplace, and by being really effective in the workplace, we can become strong in our faith. So they're mutually complementary.
Well, you talk about post-mortem retirement planning. You say, as a CPA, I've had quite a lot of experience with retirement planning.
Yeah.
People routinely make sacrifices now in order to provide a comfortable retirement down the road. What if we take that same and apply it to a much longer term goal, eternity? Don't we all aspire to a comfortable eternal retirement? It sure beats the alternative. Is the problem that people don't really believe either that there is something there or everybody's going there?
I think that's certainly part of the problem, and whichever direction it takes. But at the same time, I would argue that there's a huge opportunity because if we're serious about growing in holiness, we can't just not pay attention to that for half of the time that we're awake during any given day. And work is really kind of unique in the sense that it presents us with challenges that are simultaneously opportunities to grow. So in the book I talk about just little everyday things like how do we forgive the coworker who's a complete jerk? And I talk about a couple of the people who are really inspirational to me so that we can do things like that. But the point is, our faith should help us to become more effective.
Right.
And we should be able to do that in a way that also brings us a sense of satisfaction, that we're not just bifurcating our lives because it doesn't work.
Now, why'd you decide to put action steps and questions for reflection and stuff like that in the book?
Well, partially because it's a very practical book, so I just wanted to give people a chance to step back and say, okay, how would I address this? And for it to provoke discussions, and it's been used by a lot of different business groups, but not just business groups, just lots of people who are interested. I got one of the highest compliments that I got paid was by a mother, a stay-at-home mother of 3 or 4 kids, who called me and said, you know what, I put this to use the day after I read the book.
Really?
So I was thrilled with that. It's not just a business book, it's really for everybody.
Well, because the home, and many times with mom there, it has to be run like a workplace to keep it going. Now, you said there's really no magic to integrating faith and work. If there's no magic, why is it so difficult?
I think it's partially because people don't view it that way. They don't see the need. They don't see any impetus to do it. So that was part of the idea of the book, was really to just give perspective in a very practical manner.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Kevin Lowry.
Thank you, Doug.
Great to have you stopping by here at our Bookmark set here at the Catholic Marketing Network in Chicago. The 2 books, Faith at Work, Finding the Purpose Beyond the Paycheck, OSV, and also his new book, How God Hauled Me, Kicking and Screaming into the Catholic Church. Also OSV, both available through the EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com.